the New York Video Games Critics Circle, we value the art of effective storytelling. Whether we're teaching writing courses in public schools and shelters, playing video games in our free time, or writing reviews about those games, our interns have learned how to craft, present, and critique the stories that shape our world. But that's not all. Our interns have gone on to become brilliant journalists, game designers, and more. Today, I have the honor of speaking with Elizabeth Ballou, one of our former New York Video Games Critics Circle intern who worked on a game that I recently reviewed. Let's welcome Elizabeth.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be talking to you.
Thank you so much for coming. So let's
Yeah.
take it back to the beginning as far as games go. While you were in college, you and your friends created a point-and-click adventure game called Gray Skies, Dark Water. Can you tell us what the game's about?
Sure. So when I was in college, my college didn't have any classes in creating video games, much less classes for creating interactive media. So I just got some of my friends together and we started working on this game, and I wanted to create something that was based on the myth of the Swan Maiden, which is this really old archetype from a lot of different myths and folk tales about a woman who can change her shape at will using some kind of object. In a lot of stories, it's a coat of feathers that she puts on to become a swan, and then she can take off her coat of feathers and become a human. And in a lot of versions of the story, someone steals her coat of feathers and forces her to be a human. So in a lot of versions of that story, she eventually finds her coat again and she flies off and she leaves her children behind. And none of the folktales ever talk about what happens to the children. And I was always like, oh my gosh, that must be such a traumatic experience. Like having your mother just disappear like that. And also you're half Swan Maiden, but you don't really know it. So I wanted to try to set that story in a modern context where the main character is the oldest child of the Swan Maiden figure who's disappeared without a trace. And she wants to try to find out what actually happened to her mother and how her mother came to be living with her father. And kind of why she seems to straddle these two worlds. So the player explores her house and they explore her backyard and a park nearby and several other locations. And they talk to her other siblings. She has 3 younger siblings. And try to figure out their theory of what happened to the mother. And depending on the choices that they make and the kinds of responses that they pick in conversations, like whether or not they're willing to believe that there's a supernatural explanation of what happened, then they get a different resolution of what happens with the mom.
That sounds wonderful. I'm obsessed. Take all my money because I want to play already.
Oh,
Can you
thank
talk
you.
about some of the ups and downs of making Gray Skies, Dark Water?
Yeah. So when we started, because none of us had ever taken any classes or trained at all in making games, we didn't know what we were doing. And so Abigail, who is my dear friend and the producer and programmer of Gray Skies, Dark Waters, she and I were kind of the 2 main people trying to figure things out. So we were like, okay, well, we'll just do a Kickstarter for a few $1,000s, and that will be all the money that we need to make this game. And we just had no idea that $2,000 was not enough money to really make a game and pay people for voice acting and illustrations. And we ultimately made it work. But it meant that the game took a really long time to make. And that was okay because it gave us time to refine the kind of stories that we were telling and also try to adapt to like changes in the Unity engine so that we could, use the most current version of the engine that had the most technology to offer to us. So when the game came out, I feel like it it was kind of it's a love letter from the kind of scrappy community of game developers who are making something for the first time and don't really know what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. And that actually can really open up, I think. the creativity and let you make whatever you want.
That sounds like such a wonderful experience for your first time making a game too. Like, I just feel like that would be such a wonderful learning experience and such a fun, like, process of trial and error and coming up with something beautiful. That sounds wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And
Yeah.
to add on, you did all of this while you were pursuing your bachelor's degree in English and Spanish too, right?
Yes, I did.
So I think that degree is very broad. You're able to communicate and tell stories in many different ways. You decided to go on to a master's program where you got your master's degree in video game design. What made you decide to go that route?
Yeah, so after creating Gray Skies, Dark Waters, Abigail and I were like, oh my gosh, there is so much out there that we don't know. And now that we have actually made this game, we realize that there's a lot that we could learn. So if we make another game together, we do it a lot better. And we know how much money to ask for if we do a fundraising campaign. And we know what kind of rates to pay people, and we know how much time to budget to make the game. And so Abigail at the time was not able to go on to a grad program. I also don't really think she needed it because she's already brilliant. But I decided that I wanted to see if I could just learn more about all the different parts of making a game. I wanted to know more about, okay, what is the best way to design, say, an audio pipeline? And by pipeline, I mean like the process from start to finish of coming up with a song or a sound effect, and then it being created, and then it being put in the game and tested to make sure it works. So that whole process can take a lot of time, and there's that same kind of structure. You need it for like animation and for 2D images and for narrative content, like the writing. I just wanted to understand better how all of these things worked together, so that if I were ever making a game again, and especially if I were in charge of it, I could do so in a way that was like kind and responsible to everyone else working on the game, and I would not take their time or their talent for granted.
I really appreciate how mindful you are of like everybody involved in this process. Like just making sure everybody gets paid properly, respecting everybody's time. That's wonderful. That's something that we don't see in a lot of workplaces still to this day, sadly. So thank you so much for doing that from the very beginning. Like shout out to you.
Yeah,
Now,
definitely.
the next question is more about when during your master's program when you interned for the Circle. So I just wanted to know what drew you to writing for the New York Video Games Critics Circle.
Yeah, so the reason why that happened is because I got an email. Actually, everyone in my program got an email inviting us to come to the awards in that year. I believe they were in late January. This would have been 2019. And so I went with a few people from my program, and we were just really excited. Some of our professors were there. There were people who had flown in to accept their awards. And I met Harold at some point that night. And he mentioned the site. And then afterwards, I went on the site and started reading reviews and roundups of work that members of the circle had created that were, being kind of included in like a, here's what all of our members have done. And I started reading a lot more games journalism than I had been reading before. It kind of like varied my diet. So I don't remember quite how it happened, but at some point I became an intern and started working on stories. I think the first one that I did was I interviewed Gabe Cazillo, who makes Ape Out, which is a game that had just come out, and he graduated from the NYU Game Center too. And so I really wanted to know, because he had been in the same program as me, I wanted to know kind of how he was able to make a game as successful and engaging as Ape Out, which if you haven't played it, you're an ape and you smash things.
Well, now I have to play just because you recommended it to me. But it's also amazing. You went from becoming interviewer to interviewee. Like you made it. So
Yeah.
congrats.
Oh, thank you. It's wild.
Yeah. Well, okay, let's keep moving on. It's clear you understand how to tell stories through different mediums. For example, you speak on Twitter about being a theater fan, which I am too, so wonderful. You also are a freelance writer, a game designer, a script writer, and more. What has been your favorite way to share your writing with an audience?
So I think my favorite way so far has been Wylde Flowers because it has reached the most people of any project that I've worked on. And the thing that I really like about interactive writing is that you can bury a bunch of little nuggets of writing and characterization and then just wait for players to find them. And if you do it right, it feels really special. Like the player has this connection to the character. So the way that we did that in Wylde Flowers was we wrote a lot of dialogue that the characters could say that was dependent on different conditions, like what the weather was or what had just happened in the world. And we had a lot of fun thinking about, if the player is persistent and talks to all of the characters every day, what are they going to learn, and how is their experience going to be like enriched by learning these little nuggets of information about the characters.
I'm so glad you brought up wildflowers because I've been obsessed with that for the past few months. Can you talk
Oh,
about more about how you found out about that opportunity in the first place?
yeah, sure. So I joined the project when it had been in development for about a year. It's created by Studio Drydock, which is an Australian studio created by folks who worked on the Sims series for a really long time. So people who really knew what they were doing and then decided that they wanted to go out and make the game that they had been wanting to make for a really long time. Um, and the first narrative designer that they had hired to help them come up with the general arc of the plot and the character bios was also a graduate of the NYU Game Center. She had graduated 2 years before me. Her name is Desiree, and I adore her. I've never had so much fun working with a writing partner. But she reached out to the Game Center because they were looking for another writer. It's a narrative heavy game. Everyone currently on the project was like, Desiree, you can't do all of this on your own. So they were looking for someone who could kind of be, at first I was operating as kind of an assistant to Desiree and just figuring out, like trying to understand all of the things that she had already decided because she came up with all of these brilliant characters. And so I was learning how to write in the voices that she had already established. And then once I learned to do that, we kind of started working together as a team to fill in the rest of the world and write the quests that hadn't been written yet and stuff like that.
That sounds really cool. And I think the fact that you guys work so closely together is shown in the final product. Like it's very clear that people who cared about what they were writing and cared about this story worked behind it. I think all the players got that from jump. So you guys did a very good job working together. Can you talk
Thank
a bit more
you.
about no problem. I have nothing but compliments for you. So
Oh,
thank you so much for sharing with everything that you have to say so far. Can you talk a bit more about the narrative crafting process for this game?
yeah, sure. So the way that we handled the writing for this game was that we wrote everything into spreadsheets. And there's a lot of discussion in the games writing community about the best tools to use to write interactive stories. But I have to say, the one that I have used the most often is just spreadsheets. Because the thing about spreadsheets is that you can upload them to the game and then the programmer can write a script to kind of break down the spreadsheet by cell and send each cell to the right part of the game so that the dialogue is associated with the right character and plays at the right time. Um, so we were writing all of this dialogue into spreadsheets, and the way that we handled it was that we split up the quests and the banter which is the short lines that the characters say when you walk up to them and you talk to them on any given day. So we split that about in half, and then we would kind of go into our writer hidey holes for a while and write it, and then we would switch, and Desiree would edit what I had written, and I would edit what Desiree had written. And then when we were done with that, we would use a custom scripting language that the tech lead for the game wrote specifically for Wylde Flowers to format all of the interactions. It was kind of like staging plays. So we were kind of taking the cells from the spreadsheet and we were scripting them like you would see on a screenplay with stage directions and stuff like that.
I'm going to use this when I make my argument to my brother later that theaters and everything. And I'm going to say, you said that writing a script for a video game was similar to the way you would write one for a screenplay. So he's not going to like that, but I'm very happy to hear that analogy.
It is so true. I mean, one of the last things that I did for when we were polishing up the game and getting it ready for release was I went in and Desiree and I were working on the animations. We had an animation tool that the tech lead had designed where we could choose the animation that would go along with each line that they had and try to transition into different animations to make it look natural. And we also were doing things like changing the angle of their head so they could look up, or like if they were ashamed, they could look down, or if they were nervous, they could like look back and forth really fast. And that's basically all theater stuff because they were the actors, and then all of their words and their animations had to translate to the player who's in the kind of like the viewer seat at a theater.
Well, I got it. Like I was very surprised. Like especially, I know we have several days pass in Wylde Flowers too, and like the characters would still be responding to things that just happened, which surprised me because there's been other games that I've played where it's like everybody's moving on. What just happened? Like for example, we have like. Well, I don't want to spoil the game. Everybody should go play it for themselves. But when you have like all these big events come up, it's nice to see that the characters are actually responding to it. So I'm glad to hear about what it was like for you to work on that behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Now, I wanted to talk about something you wrote in one of your articles for The Circle. You said when video games are at their best, they challenge real life status quos and put forth new ways of looking at our own world. Now, I really admire the way that Wylde Flowers challenge our societal norms by including characters whose stories are not often told. Can you talk about some of the decisions that the design team made to effectively and authentically tell these stories?
Yes, definitely. So again, Desiree was the one who took the lead on this. And I will say I was very happy to start working on this project specifically because Desiree is Latina, and I have not often gotten the chance to work on usually when I work on a team of writers, it's a lot of just white men. And it was very exciting to me to get the opportunity to work on a team that was not like that. And the next team that I'm going to go write with is kind of similarly composed. So that's always, I think, a good first step. So Desiree, before I even came onto the project, had done a lot of research for each of the characters and was already thinking about ways to try to depict as many different backgrounds as possible, from sexuality to ethnicity to age. To body type. We tried to have, characters who are fat and have that not be a thing that's remarked on. It's just like a part of them, like the way that I have blonde hair. So that all already existed when I came on board. And so a lot of what I did was I read some of the research materials that Desiree recommended. For example, we have a Romani character, Shelby, and Desiree had read some books about the history of the Romani people being expelled from Europe. So I read that in order to be able to write authentically from Shelby's voice. And then Once we were done with all of that, we made sure that the voice actors that we were casting actually fit the backgrounds of the characters. So, you know, we were trying to make it so that each Black character was voiced by a Black actor. And like the Hawaiian character, Kai, is voiced by someone who's from Hawaii. And then the last thing that we did that I think is really important is that for a lot of the characters, we found cultural consultants to come and read all of the lines that the characters said and also look at their art to make sure that what we were doing was not offensive and that we had not inadvertently written something offensive into the game, because even with our best intentions, it is entirely possible to do that. And it's really important to have someone who's an expert come in and say, like, these are some stereotypes that this or that line might be encouraging. You should cut them and replace them with something else. So for example, the character, oh no, this is a spoiler. I can't talk about this character because you don't, right off the bat. Let's see if there are any other examples that I can talk about. I don't think there are, because I don't want to spoil it. I don't want to go too deep into any character's characterization. But yeah, there were definitely things that we changed based on the cultural consultants' feedback, which I think was extremely important in making the game feel as welcoming as it does.
I think this is just how you write responsibly, right? Like there's always going to be times you can't relate to everybody. You can't understand what everybody's been through. But I just really appreciate any time that I hear about how directors, writers, anybody in charge of telling a story includes the voices of the person whose story is being told to make sure they're not being overshadowed, especially when you have issues with, I don't know, like, I think you've touched on this a lot, so I won't go ask the question because you did already answer. Like, how do you balance amplifying the voices of those who are not listening to while writing on behalf of others when, sometimes you are the one that has to tell their story? And I think it's just, we all need to learn how to listen more. We all need to learn how to accept feedback more. And it's very clear that Wylde Flowers went above and beyond to make sure that, they were being very representative and accurate with the way that they portrayed each of these characters.
Yeah, and it can be hard to do that, and it can take time. It takes time and it takes money. And I think it's really important for studios, no matter how big they are, to, when they are coming up with their budgets, set that money aside to make sure that they can pay people to do that work, and not leave it, until the last minute or something like that. It should be something that people are thinking about from the very beginning. And when I interviewed for the job, one of the questions that I had in the interview from the creative director was like, you're going to be working on a game that has a cast of characters with a ton of different identities. Is that something that you're comfortable with? And I was like, I will do my level best with every single one of them, but I am overjoyed that you have already put these identities into the game. So like, that's clearly something you were thinking about from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point too, thinking about it from the beginning and not treating it as like an afterthought. I think just making it a very intentional part of the process, it shows in the final product.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so if any of our cultural consultants happen to be listening to this, thank you.
Thank you to you too. I don't know you, but thank you so much. You're appreciated.
Yeah.
So now my next question is not specific to Wylde Flowers, is in general. I know art can be a way of reflecting on pressing issues, or they can be a way to escape from a less than ideal reality. A couple years ago, you wrote an article for The Circle, again, about creating a game that you made while you were stuck on the train to the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco. First of all, your writing style is impeccable. Like, I was on the edge of my seat, like reading along, feeling like I was stuck on that train with you. Aww. So that was a lot of fun to read and like very educational, like very good job. But I say all of this to say that the pandemic has brought game developers and creators in general together in a similar way. While we were still apart, people had, were bonded by creating games to cope and deal with these very unprecedented times. I know everybody's tired of hearing that phrase, but they were. And, we were apart, but we needed to find a way to still be together. Do you think that gaming was the best way to bond people together at a time when they were literally separated? And if so, why do you think that this mode of art is so useful in creating community?
That's a great question. And I do think that games are one of the most powerful ways to connect us, especially when we can't be together physically. I don't know if you've ever played any Jackbox games.
I feel
They're
like I live with my siblings.
Yeah, they're like party games that they're
Mhm.
short little party games that come in packs. And before the pandemic started, like they were popular, but they were games that people played in person. But once the pandemic started, it became really popular to play Jackbox games while everyone was on a video call because you don't all have to be in the same place to do it. And so you could play these games where people were drawing things on their phone, and then the next person had to try to figure out what this other person who could be 500 miles away had drawn on their phone, which, you know, you're drawing on your phone, so like it's never going to be very good. And so that was a way that I kept in touch with a lot of my friends and family members, was we played games together. I downloaded Final Fantasy 14 and started playing with my friends who had played for a while, and it felt like, because we got to design our avatars and have a lot of say over like how they looked and what we did with them, it felt almost like we could be in the same place together. We even went to an in-game concert in Final Fantasy 14 that we never could have gone to in the real world. So it was this way, it was like the next best thing, you know?
Mhm. This does remind me of a time I think I did want to do one of those like drawing on the phone games at one point. You just pulled back a memory, and these weren't even kids that I knew. Like this was a way for also for me to meet new people and like
Mm-hmm.
find some other community when I'm pulled away from everybody and everything that I know. I was still able to outreach through games. Like everybody loves to play, everybody wants to play, so why not use it?
Yeah, and I think Discord got a lot more popular too during the pandemic because people from different game fandoms, I mean any fandom, but like especially game fandoms, were congregating together and they were talking about the games that they were playing and like sharing videos, or if they were streaming it, they would drop a link and be like, "Hey, come hang out in my stream." And I think it just became like a much easier way for people to reach for that kind of connection. I guess the only thing that became easier during the pandemic was having more of those communities to join.
Yeah, the silver lining in all of this. I'm
Mm-hmm.
glad you were able to find that. But we're almost towards the end because you shared a lot of information. I have a last couple few questions. I know you're working on some pretty cool stuff right now. I'm not sure how much detail you're able to go into, but what do you hope to learn from working on some games that you may be involved in right now?
So right now I am working for a studio called Toya Play, and we're making games in Roblox. And the goal of the games that we make is to encourage young women to play, because a lot of experiences on Roblox are not really created for young women. So the goal of Toya is to create these games that are role-playing games and story games where people can come in and all genders are welcomed. This is just meant to kind of let women know that they're welcome on Roblox and everywhere in gaming. But they can come in, they can create characters, they can role play, and it's kind of what I was talking about Final Fantasy 14. They can try to feel like they're there in the same space together, even if in person, physically, that's impossible because of COVID or because they live far apart or any other reason.
I love to hear that, and I can't wait to see the new games once they're released.
Yeah,
I
I'm
think
so, I wish I could tell you more about the one that I'm working on right now, but I'll just send you a link when it's done, when it comes
all
out.
right. I
I don't
can
know
see
if you
the
play
excitement
Roblox.
in your eyes. So
Yeah.
I think that's enough for me to get like how excited you are about this.
Yeah.
Very, very opening and makes me want to play. Now,
Good.
last but not least, I just wanted to know what is one piece of advice that you would give to young storytellers?
Oh, so this is something that I learned at the Game Center in my grad program for game design, this was like the first thing I learned, and it really blew my mind and changed the way that I thought about telling interactive stories. Was show other people what you're making as soon as possible, even if it feels really uncomfortable, and even if you don't think it's ready. Especially if it's something that people can play, that they can interact with. You're not only getting their reaction to something that you are writing, you're also getting their reaction on how it feels and if it's possible to like navigate through the experience that you've created. But even if it's not interactive, just getting other people's reactions, and finding it in that way, you can find other people who are interested in creating what you are making too, and so you can kind of start forming communities that way. I think that is the most important thing that you can do.
I definitely needed to hear that. It's just, I know it gets so nerve-wracking sharing your writing with people. It can be very vulnerable, but as you said, you can find people who are interested in what you're writing about. You can get some feedback. There's just so many good things that can come from sharing your work. So you can't be afraid and keep it all to yourself. So thank you for sharing, because it came at a very good time.
Of course, there are always people out there who are going to connect with your story. You just have to find them.
I have to remember this. But thank you so much. Yeah. I think those are all the questions that I have for today, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for stopping by.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Anyway, as we just wrap up this interview, this was a circle interview with Elizabeth Ballou and Makeda Byfield. Thank you so much for tuning in.